With the end of the transatlantic slave trade and the abolition of slavery worldwide, the Europeans would lose what they considered a valuable resource, a means of cheap labor and an access to wealth in the Caribbean and Africa. You see, the success of these so-called European powers had been built on the back of African slaves. These countries went above and beyond to advance their civilizations by enslaving the fellow human race and claiming that the color of their skin made them less human. With the end of this brutal trade, the Europeans were going to regress. However, these European powers would not just sit by and watch so much potential go to waste. Rather than let Africa be, after igniting wars, disrupting cultures, and plundering its people for centuries, the Europeans would move to exploit all the resources from its people, introducing a new form of slavery known as colonization. The scramble for Africa was a period during the late 19th century when European powers sought to colonize and control vast territories on the African continent. This race for African dominance was driven by a combination of economic, political, and strategic interests. European nations were motivated by a desire to secure valuable resources, expand their markets, and establish a foothold in Africa for geopolitical reasons. One of the primary motivations for European powers was the abundance of natural resources in Africa. The continent was rich in minerals, including gold, diamonds, and various metals, as well as agricultural products such as rubber, cocoa, and palm oil. These resources were essential for industrialization in Europe, and controlling their production and distribution became a top priority. Italy joined this race for African lands in the 1880s, but it was a bit late and only managed to take Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Italy, as a newly unified nation, wanted to show Europe it could dominate weaker populations and be part of the powerful European club. To maintain the colonies it had created, the nation employed every means of cruelty possible. In this video, we embark on a journey into the shadows of history, aiming to unearth the untold stories of tragedy and suffering inflicted upon African nations by Italy's quest for power and domination. We will delve into the depths of this troubling history, revealing the crimes committed by a nation that sought to exploit and destroy in the name of empire. Before we get right into the video, please smash the like button and subscribe to the channel to keep informed of our eye-opening black narrative, the Addis Ababa massacre. The Addis Ababa massacre took place on February 19, 1937, when Italian forces under the command of General Rodolfo Graziani carried out a brutal and indiscriminate attack on the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. The assault was in response to an assassination attempt on Graziani, which he survived but used as a pretext for a violent crackdown. Before the Addis Ababa massacre, Italy had indeed attempted to conquer Ethiopia and establish it as a protectorate. This effort culminated in the First Italo-Ethiopian War, a significant conflict that ultimately resulted in an Ethiopian victory. Let's go into the details of this historical event. The First Italo-Ethiopian War, also known as the Battle of ADWA, took place between 1895 and 1896. Italy, then led by Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, sought to expand its colonial empire by conquering Ethiopia, which was one of the few African nations that had successfully resisted European colonization. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia began in late 1895 when Italian forces, armed with modern weaponry and supported by a well-equipped army, crossed into Ethiopian territory from the colony of Eritrea. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, recognizing the threat, had spent years modernizing and reforming his army. He mobilized a diverse Ethiopian force, which included infantry, cavalry, and traditional warriors armed with spears and swords. The two sides clashed at the decisive Battle of ADWA on March 1, 1896, near the town of ADWA in northern Ethiopia. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Emperor Menelik's Ethiopian forces demonstrated remarkable unity and determination. They utilized effective military strategies, including a well-coordinated encirclement of the Italian troops. The Battle of ADWA resulted in a resounding Ethiopian victory. Italian forces suffered heavy casualties, and their retreat from Ethiopia was marked by significant losses. This defeat was a major embarrassment for Italy and a significant setback to its imperial ambitions in Africa. As a result of the Treaty of Addis Ababa signed in October 1896, Italy formally recognized Ethiopia's sovereignty, and the Ethiopian Empire retained its independence. It was a rare and significant victory against European colonial powers during the age of imperialism, and it contributed to Ethiopia's status as a symbol of African resistance to foreign domination. The humiliating defeat at the Battle of ADWA in 1896 served as a source of national embarrassment for Italy and a motive for revenge. This led to the outbreak of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, also known as the Abyssinian War, which began in 1935. This time, Italy, under the rule of Benito Mussolini and in the throes of fascism, came with overwhelming force and modern military technology. During the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, Italy sought to avenge its earlier defeat and expand its colonial empire in Africa. Mussolini's regime was eager to showcase its military prowess and used the conflict as a way to rally domestic support while pursuing imperial ambitions. Italy's military was well equipped with machine guns, artillery pieces, tanks, and aircraft, giving them a substantial technological advantage. In contrast, many Ethiopian fighters were armed with outdated weapons like spears, swords, and bows and arrows. This marked a vast disparity in firepower. One of the most notorious aspects of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War was the use of chemical weapons by Italian forces. Italy violated international agreements, including the Geneva Protocol of 1925, by deploying toxic gases, including mustard gas, against Ethiopian soldiers and civilians. The use of chemical weapons resulted in significant suffering and casualties, causing horrific injuries and long-term health problems among the Ethiopian population. Italian forces also engaged in brutal tactics such as aerial bombardments of civilian areas, including towns and villages. These indiscriminate bombings caused extensive damage and civilian casualties, with little regard for the lives of non-combatants. Another horrifying aspect of the war was the Italian practice of reprisals. When Italian forces encountered resistance or attacks from Ethiopian fighters, they often responded with severe reprisals against civilians. These included mass killings, looting, and the burning of villages, resulting in the displacement and suffering of countless Ethiopians. Despite the overwhelming odds against them, Ethiopian forces displayed remarkable bravery and determination throughout the conflict. They engaged in guerrilla warfare and continued to resist Italian occupation in various parts of the country. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War lasted until 1936, when Italy, after utilizing its superior military power and committing various war crimes, finally managed to conquer Ethiopia and claim it as a colony under the name Italian East Africa. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, Marquis of Negale, Viceroy of Italian East Africa, had led the Italian forces to victory over the Ethiopians in the Second Italian invasion of Ethiopia and was proclaimed Supreme Governor of Italian East Africa. Despite having unquestioned control over the new Italian East Africa at the beginning of February 1937, Graziani still mistrusted its inhabitants. During the previous year, following the capture of Jijiga by his men, he was inspecting an Ethiopian Orthodox church when he fell through a concealed hole in the floor, which he was convinced had been prepared as a man-trap for him. Despite this, to celebrate the birth of the Prince of Naples, Graziani announced he would personally distribute alms to the poor on Friday, the 19th of February, at the Genete-Leul Palace, also known as the Little Gebi. In the crowd that formed that Friday morning were two young Eritreans living in Ethiopia named Abraha Debok and Mogus Askedom. Finding their fortunes limited in the Italian colony, they had come to Ethiopia to enroll in the Menelik II school, where recent events had overtaken them. Apparently accommodating himself to the new administration, Abraha gained employment with the fascist political bureau, where his Eritrean origin, knowledge of Italian, and familiarity with the city made him useful. However, according to Richard Pankhurst, Abraha Debok was bitterly opposed to the Italians, especially its racist practices. Before leaving their house, Abraha had placed an Italian flag on the wooden floor, driven a bayonet through it, then tied an Ethiopian flag to the bayonet. The official ceremony began as might be expected. Graziani made a speech. A number of Ethiopian notables made their submission to the victors. Italian planes made a flyover above the city, and at 11 o'clock officials began distributing the promised alms to priests and the poor. Abraha and Mogus managed to slip through the crowd to the bottom of the steps to the Little Gebi, then began throwing grenades. According to one account, they managed to lob 10 of them before escaping in the resulting confusion. According to Richard Pankhurst, they were rushed from the scene by a third conspirator, a taxi driver named Simeon Adafres. Pankhurst also credits him with providing the grenades that Abraha and Mogus threw. It is said that Adafres had managed to procure the grenades from a soldier of the Ethiopian resistance to the Italian colonization, whom he had befriended, and that this same soldier, a machine gunner, taught Abraha and Mogus how to use the grenades. Behind them, the dead included Abuna Carelos's umbrella bearer. The wounded included the Abuna himself, the Vice Governor General Armando Petretti, General Aurelio Leota of the Air Force, and the Viceroy himself. One grenade exploded next to him, sending 365 fragments into his body. Graziani was rushed to the Italian hospital where he was operated on immediately and saved. General Leota lost his leg to the attack. For a while, Abraha and Mogus hid at the ancient monastery of Debre Libanos, but soon moved on, seeking sanctuary in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Somewhere in Gojam, local inhabitants, always suspicious of strangers, murdered them. Adafres returned to Addis Ababa after having driven Abraha and Mogus to the monastery, their first destination, where he remained with them for a week. However, soon after his return to the capital, he was arrested by fascist authorities and tortured to death. The Italian response was immediate. According to Mockler, Italian carabinieri had fired into the crowds of beggars and poor assembled for the distribution of alms, and it is said that the federal secretary, Guido Cortese, even fired his revolver into the group of Ethiopian dignitaries standing around him. 7 hours later, Cortese gave the fatal order. Comrades, today is the day when we should show our devotion to our viceroy by reacting and destroying the Ethiopians for 3 days. For 3 days, I give you carte blanche to destroy and kill and do what you want to the Ethiopians. For the rest of that day, through Saturday and Sunday, Italians killed Ethiopians with daggers and truncheons to the shouts of Duce, Duce, and Civiltà Italiana. They doused native houses with petrol and set them on fire. They broke into the homes of local Greeks and Armenians and lynched their servants. Some even posed on the corpses of their victims to have their photographs taken. In 3 days, the Italians had killed between 1,400 and 30,000 Ethiopians in Addis Ababa alone. The first day has been commemorated as Yekatit 12 inches, Ethiopian February 19th, by Ethiopians ever since. There is a monument called by the same name in Addis Ababa in memory of those Ethiopian victims of Italian aggression. The attempted murder provided the Italians with the reason to implement Mussolini's order, issued as early as the 3rd of May, 1936, for the summary execution of the young Ethiopians, the small group of intellectuals who had received college education from American and European colleges. The same day as the assassination, a military tribunal was set up, and by nightfall, 62 Ethiopians were tried and shot at the Alam Bikan prison in Addis Ababa. The Graziani massacre marked the almost total liquidation of the intellectual component of the resistance. Thousands of Ethiopians of all classes were sent to detention camps at Danan in the Ogaden and Nokra in the Dahlak archipelago. Conditions at Danan were inhospitable, and Graziani had given orders that the prisoners would receive only the bare minimum of food and water. As Spaki notes, poor facilities, including latrines, the humid climate, malaria, stomach infections, and venereal disease took many lives, especially among those compelled to work on the irrigation canal or on the banana and sugarcane plantations. Between 10% and half of the prisoners died at Danan. Conditions at Nokra were even worse than at Danan, according to Spaki. The detainees sent there joined 500 prisoners serving life sentences for serious political crimes, increasing the total number incarcerated to 1,500. The inmates suffered from lack of fresh water, sunstroke, marsh fever, and dysentery. The final reprisal struck in May. Investigators found that Abraha and Mogus had stayed a while at Debre Libanos, and slight circumstantial evidence suggested that the monks had foreknowledge of their plans. Graziani, mindful of his misadventure at Jijiga, believed that they were complicit and on the 19th of May, cabled the local commander, therefore execute summarily all monks without distinction, including the vice prior. The following day, the feast day of their patron Saint Tekla Haymanot, according to the records of the Italian fascists, monks plus 23 laymen were shot, the entire population of the monastery. Other sources estimate the death toll at 1,500 to 2,000. Italy was never forced to reckon with fascism as Germany was with Nazism. Few post-war Italian historians ever tackled the massacre. Those that did were often denounced as unpatriotic. Angelo Del Boca, writing in the 1960s, was accused by the Italian army of being a liar for his research on Graziani's crimes. When Lion of the Desert, a film depicting his actions in Libya, was released in 1981, it was soon banned for damaging the honor of the Italian army. To this day, Italian schoolchildren are not taught about the Addis Ababa massacre. Graziani is little known, his sins even less so. Angelo Del Boca, a pioneer in Italian colonial studies, was among the first to uncover these suppressed war crimes. He opposed the fascist regime, even during its peak, and continued to call out its faults after it ended. This was a time when Italy preferred to focus on the future rather than confront an uncomfortable past. As the country embraced amnesia, Del Boca started a project to find information about Italy's colonies. From his research, we learned that Mussolini, who was the Minister of War in 1926, had plans to invade Ethiopia but decided it was too costly at the time. Italy only invaded Ethiopia in 1935, starting the Ethiopian campaign. Mussolini pushed for harsh measures against the Ethiopians, often dehumanizing them, and even treating them like prey in a hunt. We have evidence of Mussolini's personal involvement in decision-making through telegrams exchanged with his officials and generals. He was ruthless, particularly in his orders to use toxic gases, even though they violated the Geneva Convention, which Italy had signed. Mussolini didn't care about international rules. Despite the international outcry, he authorized the use of any war tactic, including considering bacteriological warfare. His officials managed to dissuade him from that, pointing out the global backlash it would cause. The Italian side's behavior wasn't just violent in actions, but also in ideology. Mussolini saw the war as a test of the new Italian and a chance to boost the true man's honor. Journalist Indro Montanelli, who fought in Ethiopia as a volunteer soldier, called the war a grand holiday. He represents how fascist ideas influenced people seeking glory. Even though he later distanced himself from fascism, he still defended his role in the colonial war. Even though Del Boca did a lot of research on Italian war crimes in Ethiopia, his findings were not well received by academics. He faced harassment and threats from the right-wing media, who accused him of being unpatriotic and spreading lies. Del Boca also had trouble accessing primary sources about the colonial period because a committee in charge of organizing these documents was controlled by former officials from the Ministry of Italian Africa. This committee had a strong pro-colonial bias and published a 40-volume collection called L'Italia in Africa that distorted history to protect their interests. They controlled access to state archives, making it hard for anti-colonial historians like Del Boca to get the information they needed. Even in the late 1970s, more progressive scholars were denied access to these sources, making it tough to uncover the truth about the African campaign. This lack of access to sources contributed to hiding past wrongdoings. The romanticized view of Italians in Africa as good people building roads and helping locals become civilized whitewashed their faults and crimes. It was a racist and patronizing perspective that covered up more harmful actions. Even prominent figures in the colonial war like Montanelli and other veterans continued to uphold this view. Italy's failure to offer an official apology to Ethiopia for its colonial crimes, notably the Addis Ababa massacre, remains an unresolved issue in history. The Ethiopian people endured significant suffering during Italy's imperial expansion, with thousands losing their lives and their nation's sovereignty being severely compromised. Italy continues to claim historical denial and try to paint a different picture of the atrocities committed in the African country. Some Italian officials and scholars have downplayed the severity of their country's actions, arguing that Ethiopia was a legitimate target for colonization. This denial has obstructed the acknowledgement of the true scale of the atrocities committed during the colonization. Even worse, there is no sustained international pressure and attention on the issue, which may be contributing to Italy's continued avoidance of addressing its colonial legacy. Without significant external pressure, the issue remains unresolved, leaving historical wounds unhealed and justice unaddressed. Italy's colonization of Somalia. The story of Italy's colonization of Somalia is one marked by brutality, exploitation, and the erosion of a rich cultural heritage. It began with Italy's aggressive expansion into Somali territories in the late 19th century and culminated in the ruthless suppression of Somali resistance, leaving a trail of suffering, death, and destruction in its wake. The Italian colonization of Somalia commenced in Mogadishu when they purchased the Banadir region from Said Bargash, a local ruler. This marked the inception of Italy's imperial ambitions in the Horn of Africa. As the Italians ventured further south and southwest, they encountered fierce resistance from the Somali people. The Italian takeover resembled a colonial enterprise akin to the East India Company. Their expansion was marked by a relentless drive to assert dominance, often at the expense of Somali lives. One such instance of resistance was in Warshaik, where the local populace vehemently opposed the Italian encroachment. The response from the colonizers was brutal, resulting in the death of 7 Italians and the merciless killing of 40 Somalis. In the 1890s, Italian-occupied Marca was the center of the Baimal culture. This sparked the beginning of conflict and outrage among the Baimal clan, and soon after the Wadan. The clans would represent the core of the initial Somali resistance against Italy colonialism. The conflict escalated when an Italian resident of the city, Giacomo Trevis, was assassinated in 1904. In response, Italy seized control of the port town of Jazeera, located about 30 miles south of Mogadishu. In retaliation, Bimal leaders organized a major conference, rallying the Banadiri clans for support. The resistance movement was initially clan-based, but eventually took on a strong religious dimension. Prominent local Islamic teachers from the Baimal clan, Sheikh Abdi Ghafal and Ma'alin Mursal Abdi Yusuf, emerged as leaders of the resistance. Over time, the resistance movement expanded to include not only the Baimal clan, but also some members of the Wadan, Hintire, and other clans belonging to the Galedi Confederation. The primary goal of this resistance was to counter the Italian expansion and their decision to cut off trade between the ports and the interior regions. The Ma'alims, who were Quranic school teachers and religious leaders, including imams of Marca and the Baimal clan, played a crucial role in leading the resistance against the colonial occupation of Banadir. However, they and their followers faced significant sacrifices and hardships in the process. At the start of the conflict, Italian garrisons in both Marca and Jazeera found themselves under siege and faced a struggle for survival. Italy dispatched additional troops to provide support, but they suffered significant losses in the process. In February 1907, a crucial battle took place at Turunli, also known as Danani, located north of Marca. Approximately 2,000 Banadiri warriors, led by Sheikh Abdi Abikar Ghafle, a respected Bimal religious leader and imam, engaged in combat against 1,000 Italian troops. These Italian forces received assistance from around 1,500 Arab, Eritrean, and Somali mercenaries under the command of Lieutenant Gustavo Pacenti. The battle commenced after midnight on February 9, 1907, and raged on until noon on the 10th. Ultimately, the Banadiri warriors withdrew, leaving behind hundreds dead and wounded. Despite suffering significant casualties, the Italians regarded the Battle of Turunli as a major military triumph. Lieutenant Pacenti, the regiment's commander, celebrated this victory in an eyewitness account. In July 1908 at Finlo, the Baimal clan sought vengeance and triumphed over approximately 500 Italian troops. Nevertheless, by 1908, major urban centers like Afgoy had surrendered to the Italians. However, the Italian conquest was not yet complete. From 1910 to the 1920s, under the leadership of Sheikh Abdi Abikar Ghafle, the Banadiri coalition remained the primary opposition to Italian rule in the riverine region. However, the absence of a well-organized Somali force during this period left the Somali people vulnerable to Italian aggression. The fascist government under Benito Mussolini sought to eliminate any resistance, prompting organized opposition from religious scholars and students. However, this resistance often met with overwhelming force. Despite the tenacity of the Somali resistance, Italy eventually managed to subdue the opposition through a combination of military force and brutal tactics. Italian forces used modern weaponry and military strategies to gain the upper hand. Additionally, they employed scorched earth policies, burning villages and destroying food supplies to weaken the Somali fighters. The end result of this brutal suppression was the establishment of Italian colonial rule in Somalia. By the early 1920s, Italy had secured control over the region, and the Somali population was subjected to the harsh realities of colonialism. the Somali people were forced to accept Italian language, culture, and governance, eroding their traditional way of life. Italy's colonization of Somalia was accompanied by a heavy human toll. Thousands of Somalis were forced into labor under harsh conditions, leading to disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. The village of Kalia Saili in Lower Shabelle stands as a grim testament to this suffering, as thousands lost their lives while digging a water channel for the Italians. Being occupied by Italy meant even more woes for the Somalis, as Italy would use their manpower to conquer other African territories. During the fighting between Italy and Ethiopia, over 6,000 Somalis were forcibly conscripted into the conflict, resulting in a tragic loss of life. These forced conscriptions were indicative of the brutal and exploitative nature of Italian colonial rule. One of the most devastating aspects of Italy's colonization of Somalia was the systematic dismantling of the country's traditional governance system. The Italian colonial authorities aimed to erase the existing power structures and replace them with their own rule. Before the arrival of the Italians, Somalia was home to a complex web of kingdoms and city-states, including the Geledi Empire in the Lower Shabelle region. These entities held deep historical and cultural significance for the Somali people. However, the Italian colonizers saw these structures as obstacles to their domination. The Geledi Kingdom, for instance, stood as a symbol of Somali heritage and sovereignty. As the Italians extended their control, they dismantled these kingdoms and city-states, erasing centuries of history and cultural identity. The destruction of these institutions left a void in Somali society, one that would be filled by the oppressive rule of the colonizers. Italy's colonization of Somalia also led to the erosion of the country's rich cultural traditions. The Italian authorities sought to impose their own culture and values on the Somali people, diminishing the unique cultural tapestry that had thrived for generations. Somali traditions, customs, and languages were marginalized as Italian culture was promoted. The suppression of Somali languages and the imposition of Italian as the official language further alienated the Somali population from their own heritage. The destruction of traditional economic systems had dire consequences for the Somali people as well. Somalia had a thriving economy with trade routes and markets that had flourished for centuries. Italy's colonial policies disrupted these economic structures, leading to a decline in prosperity and self-sufficiency. By 1935, Mogadishu had evolved into a significant naval base and port for the Italians. Italy's Prime Minister Benito Mussolini considered Greater Somalia to be the prized possession in Italy's colonial empire in Africa. Mussolini saw himself not as an invader, but as a liberator of the Somali territories under occupation, which included the Ogaden region, a disputed area claimed by the Ethiopian Empire. He used this justification to support his plan to invade Ethiopia. In October 1935, the southern front of the Second Italo-Abyssinian War was launched into Ethiopia from Italian Somaliland. The invasion forces in the south were commanded by Italian General Rodolfo Graziani. More than 40,000 Somali troops actively participated in the war, primarily as combat units. They complemented the over 80,000 Italian soldiers who joined them at the outset of the offensive. Many of these Somali troops were veterans who had previously served in Italian Libya. During the invasion of Ethiopia, Mogadishu played a critical role as a primary supply base. Following the conclusion of the war in June 1936, Italian Somaliland became part of Italian East Africa, forming the Somalia Governorate. This new colony of the Italian Empire also included Ethiopia and Eritrea. To commemorate their victory, an Arch of Triumph was constructed in Mogadishu. It wasn't until 1960 that Somalia would finally gain its independence from Italy and become a sovereign nation. Today, Italy's silence regarding its colonial past in Ethiopia and Somalia speaks volumes about the nation's reluctance to confront the years of suffering, exploitation, and poverty it brought upon the Ethiopian Somali people. Rather than acknowledging and addressing this dark chapter in its history, Italy appears to prefer burying the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath. This brings us to the end of this video. Tell us what you think in the comment section, as we are always interested in your thoughts. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about blacks and to hear their own part of the narratives. Thanks for watching.